Tucker Carlson has to say tonight. He's receiving a lot of abuse for using replacement rhetoric that's supposedly leading to an epidemic of these white shooters like the one we had in Buffalo. So let's go straight to Tucker Carlson.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight there was a horrifying, we're sad to tell you, a horrifying amount of violence in the United States over the weekend, as increasingly there is. Over just 2 days, at least 104 Americans were shot to death in major American cities. That's a lot. How many? Well, for perspective, on the single deadliest day of the Iraq War, that would be January of 2005, a total of 37 Americans died. So what's happening in our cities right now looks a lot like a war, even if we rarely acknowledge it. Dallas, Milwaukee, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, many other metro areas recorded murders over the weekend. That's typical now. In St. Louis, 13 people were shot, 5 of them fatally. In Chicago, 33 were gunned down, 5 of those died. In Laguna Woods, California, a Chinese immigrant from Las Vegas walked into a Presbyterian church and shot 6 elderly Taiwanese parishioners. Police say he was motivated by some kind of political and ethnic hatred. And of course, most famously of all, on Saturday afternoon, a teenager in a mock military uniform walked into a grocery store in Buffalo and shot more than a dozen strangers with a rifle. No doubt you've seen accounts of this on the news. What you probably haven't seen are details about any of the 10 Americans who were murdered in that store in Buffalo. You may not even know their names, much less who they were or who they loved. Most of them were black. We know that. But beyond the way they look, not a lot has been reported about them, because the coverage hasn't been about them. Nor, in fact, has it really been about the gunman. He was an 18-year-old called Peyton Gendron. Gendron was mentally ill. Everyone around him knew that, including his teachers and the local police. Less than a year ago, Gendron was committed to a mental hospital after threatening to murder his classmates at a school graduation ceremony. So on Saturday, after he made good on his long-standing threat to open fire into a crowd, Gendron left an 180-page letter that he said would explain his motives. You've probably heard this document described as a racist manifesto. But that's not quite right. It's definitely racist, bitterly so. Gendron reduces people to their skin color. That's the essence of racism, and it's immoral. But what he wrote does not add up to a manifesto. It is not a blueprint for a new extremist political movement, much less the potential inspiration for a racist revolution. Anyone who claims that it is lying or hasn't read it. Instead, Gendron's letter is a rambling pastiche of slogans and internet memes, some of which flatly contradict one another. The document is not recognizably left-wing or right-wing. It's not really political at all. The document is crazy. It's the product of a diseased and organized mind. At one point, Gendron suggests that Fox News is part of some global conspiracy against him. He writes like the mental patient he is, disjointed, irrational, paranoid. Now, that's true, not that it makes the atrocities he committed easier to bear. If your daughter was murdered on Saturday in Buffalo, you wouldn't care why the killer did it or who he voted for. But the truth about Peyton Gendron does tell you a lot about the ruthlessness and dishonesty of our political leadership. Within minutes of Saturday's shooting, before all of the bodies of those 10 murdered Americans had even been identified by their loved ones, professional Democrats had begun a coordinated campaign to blame those murders on their political opponents. They did it, they said, immediately. Peyton Gendron was the heir to Donald Trump, they told us. Trumpism committed mass murder in Buffalo. And for that reason, it followed logically, we must suspend the First Amendment. That's hardly an exaggeration of what they're saying. Here's a selection from yesterday's Sunday shows.
Social media companies and law enforcement have not done enough to monitor, to ban, to restrict, and to limit hate speech on their sites. Hate speech is not freedom of speech.
As you know, the First Amendment does not protect hate speech.
I'll protect the First Amendment any day of the week, but you don't protect hate speech. You don't protect incendiary speech. You're not allowed to scream fire in a crowded theater. There are limitations on speech, and right now we have seen this run rampant.
So what is hate speech? Well, it's speech that our leaders hate. So because a mentally ill teenager murdered strangers, you cannot be allowed to express your political views out loud. That's what they're telling you. That's what they've wanted to tell you for a long time. But Saturday's massacre gives them a pretext, a justification. You have to ask yourself, who behaves like that? What sort of person uses mass murder as an excuse to give a campaign speech or seize more political power? We'll find out tomorrow when Joe Biden travels to the scene of this atrocity in Buffalo to speak to the country. We haven't seen an advanced copy of his remarks, but we can guess what we will hear. Biden's approval rating appears to be the lowest ever recorded for a president this century, lower than Donald Trump's. That is a disaster for his party. The Democratic Party will suffer for this in this fall's elections. Biden still has time to change course and fix it. He could try to improve the lives of voters who are dissatisfied with him. That is entirely possible. That's what politicians typically do when they're down. They listen to the people who might reelect them. But Biden doesn't plan to do that, and we know for a fact because Politico just reported it. Instead, Biden has decided to attack people who disapprove. According to Politico, quote, Biden has taken to telling his aides that he no longer recognizes the GOP, which he now views as an existential threat to the nation's democracy, end quote. People who disagree with Joe Biden, according to Joe Biden, are now a, quote, existential threat to the nation, like al-Qaeda or climate change. A threat that by definition is so profound we must declare war upon it if we're to survive. Now, keep in mind, this threat that Biden is referring to is you. He's talking about his fellow Americans. No president has ever spoken like this, ever. Joe Biden does it regularly, and he's certain to do it again tomorrow. But most painful and destructive of all, Biden is likely to use racial wounds in order to make his point. There is no behavior worse than this. All race politics is bad, no matter what flavor those politics happen to be. No race politics is better than any other. All of it is poison. Race politics subsumes the individual into the group. It erases people. It dehumanizes them. Race politics elevates appearance over initiative and decency and all the other God-given qualities that makes every person of every color unique yet morally equal to every other person. And above all, race politics always makes us hate each other, and always in a very predictable way. So let's say you were to make identity politics mandatory in your country, as they have. How could you be surprised when that leads, as it inevitably will, to white identity politics? Well, you could not be surprised. You did it, and it was always going to happen. And then what happens next? Nothing good. Race politics is a sin. Race politics always leads to violence and death. They learned that lesson in Rwanda in 1994. Identity politics ended in genocide in Rwanda that killed 800,000 people. And in response to those horrors, the Rwandans did something that we might learn from. They moved in the opposite direction from the one that Joe Biden is currently taking in the United States. Quote, ethnicity has already been stripped out of school books and rubbed off government identity cards, reported the New York Times. Government documents no longer mention Hutu or Tutsi, and the country's newspapers and radio stations steer clear of the labels as well. Most dramatic is how Rwanda's 8 million people now shun the identifications, the racial identifications, that seemed to loom so large 10 years ago as Hutu extremists began their mass killings, end quote. They have de-emphasized race in Rwanda, intentionally and systematically. Rwandan citizens are citizens first, members of racial or tribal groups second, or not at all. Result? There have been no more genocides in Rwanda, and that could easily be the path forward for this country too. There was only one answer to rising racial tension, and that's to de-escalate, and do what we have done and tried to do for hundreds of years, which is work toward colorblind meritocracy, and treat people as human beings created by God, rather than as faceless members of interest groups that might benefit some political party or other. We have a moral duty to do this because all people have equal moral value, no matter what they look like. All lives matter, period. That's not the determination of the US government, that's the determination of God, and it's true. And most Americans already believe it. They would like to see a return to the American way of life, and the American way of life is meritocracy. Judge me by what I do, not by how I look, by the content of my character, not the color of my skin. We have a monument on the mall to this. And yet suddenly, every voice in power is leading us in the opposite direction. And what's the terminus of that journey? It's destruction. Everybody knows this. Only our leaders stand in the way of fixing a problem that is growing worse by the day. Glenn Greenwald has watched all of this. He's an independent journalist. His work is on Substack, among other places. He joins us tonight. Glenn, thanks so much for coming on. So every mass shooting, of course, is a tragedy. Every murder is a tragedy. Every death is a tragedy. But how chilling was it to watch the immediate mobilization of a political party using the pretext of a killing to make baldly political points? I don't think I've ever seen anything like it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things a healthy society does is unites whenever there's a horrific act that violates the values of all decent people. We saw that in the wake of 9/11, for example, for a few days or a couple of weeks. But unfortunately, another path can be taken, and often is, by political leaders. You might remember in 1995 when there was that hideous attack on the federal courthouse in Oklahoma City. The Clinton administration immediately seized on that to say we need a backdoor access to be able to control the internet where this information is spreading. After 9/11, with the war on terror, right-wing leaders like Newt Gingrich explicitly argued we need to amend the First Amendment to control the ability of Muslim radicals to be able to spread their hateful message. So often these crises are seized upon by leaders to demand more power. This idea that, for example, the First Amendment doesn't protect hate speech is completely false. The Supreme Court has said the opposite. But I also think that what's critical to note is that every political ideology, every last one, has psychopaths or extremists who carry out violence in the name of that ideology, and to try and blame your political opponents or to ascribe fault or guilt to people who share that ideology is a completely morally atrocious act because you're exploiting the corpses and not expressing sadness over them.
Shouldn't there at least be a pause? I mean, I think all of us can learn lessons from tragedy. Why do people do what they do? How did this happen? I think we should know. I think that of all tragedies. But it seems like the period where we sort of pause and let the sadness sink in, and remember we're all united by our ultimate deaths, which we are, it makes us equal as people, that time has evaporated. It's like instant now. And I wonder what that says about our leaders.
I was really amazed at not just the rapidity with which this coordinated messaging campaign emerged to try and blame this network and political opponents, but also just how unanimous it was, particularly since the only thing that was known about the person who carried out this massacre was a 181-page, very densely written manifesto that, as you said, had a wide range of kind of unrelated ideas. He called himself a left-wing authoritarian on the one hand, a fascist on the other hand. There was no way these people could have taken the time to have read that, to have learned about the mental health of this person. They didn't care what the facts were. They saw an opportunity in those corpses laying on the ground, and the opportunity was political and exploitative, and they seized on it together and quickly in a way that made clear that their concern or sadness for the victims was a complete pretense. They instantly weaponized it before anything was known.
Anyone who shows no reverence in the face of death should make us nervous. It's a sign of ruthlessness and bad character. I think that anyone's death, any place, I believe that. I know you do too. Glenn Greenwald, thank you so much.
Thanks, Tucker.
So it was the usual activists who used the murders in Buffalo over a weekend to attack their political opponents, including, as you just heard, this channel. On Twitter, Mike Davis at the Article 3 Project pointed out that it's, quote, disgusting and insane to exploit this tragedy. Twitter suspended him for pointing that out. So someone who said, actually, we shouldn't jump to quick and dirty partisan conclusions from a mass murder was banned from saying that by Twitter. So this tells you a lot. Let that sink in for a moment. In the meantime, we want to bring on Harmeet Dillon, who is the country's premier civil rights attorney, CEO of the Center for American Liberty. And we're happy to have her join us now. Harmeet, thanks so much for coming on. So it seems to me, at base, not even a political point, but a humane point to say, hold on a second, we don't know everything. Let's just bow before the sadness of this moment and not jump to politically convenient conclusions from it, try to take other people's rights away on the basis of it. And that's now hate speech? Tell me how this works.
Well, this is exactly how Twitter has been working, as well as the other social media companies for the last few years. We've now learned that the government has a lot to do with this. But in short, this is a microcosm. Something horrible happens. Politically powerful voices with blue checks and a lot of followers immediately began spreading talking points. Those are propagated and spread further by these algorithms that the tech companies, which are staffed by these woke, young people, put out there. And then you have this story that has nothing to do with what actually happened. It's like a digital game of telephone, the game we used to play when we were kids. And so here, Mike Davis simply pointed out that before we rush to judgment, let's look at a few things that this person actually said. He took a couple of screenshots and he put them out there of the shooter's own words, which are very different than the narrative that the Biden administration and their lackeys in the media have been pushing. And he got suspended from Twitter for supposedly, it's unclear. They didn't even explain why. We assume that it's because of this tweet. Now, Mike is very well connected. He's clerk on the Supreme Court. He has a lot of allies in Washington, and a lot of people complained about this over the last few hours. And Twitter took notice of those powerful people talking back, and they unsuspended him today, saying that it was a mistake and an error. But thousands of people every day are taken down from social media for doing exactly what Mike did, which is saying truthful or thoughtful things that are not in the narrative that the left is trying to push, and their voices are silenced, sometimes permanently. So this is what's wrong with social media. Users have no rights. Mike had no way of knowing that what he put out there was going to get him suspended and not able to speak on this important topic. And this really needs to change, Tucker. There's so many things wrong with this picture that really limit our speech. And the end result, Tucker, is to make people like you and me think twice before we say truthful things on social media for fear of not being able to say the next truthful thing. And that's not healthy.
Well, it's so unhealthy. And by the way, it makes people paranoid and afraid. And it gives rise to conspiracy theories because clamping down on speech always does that. Why not let people speak? And the consenting adults who choose our leaders in this, quote, democracy can decide for themselves who's right on the basis of whatever facts are presented. I mean, it seems counterproductive. If you want to make people less crazy, if you want to lower the temperature, if you want to make the country more stable, you don't crack down on speech. That's the last thing you do, correct?
Absolutely. And the antidote to speech that you don't like is more speech, not silencing it. Glenn was exactly right. This has been done by the left and by the right. The Patriot Act is one of the big mistakes of my lifetime and by our government. But you have people even on the, I wouldn't even call her on the right. Liz Cheney came out today and put out a very divisive statement blaming House leadership for white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and so on. I mean, really get a hold of yourself. That's really not what happened here in this circumstance. And crazy people do crazy things. And the mental health failure in this situation is going unexamined because that is not the narrative that the left wants to push. And the left is in control of the narrative that we get to see. And again, nothing wrong with hearing different viewpoints. It doesn't kill me to hear different viewpoints. Project Veritas has a video out today showing that exactly is what is happening is that Twitter employees acknowledge that the left is intolerant of different viewpoints. The right is happy to hear different viewpoints. And so guess what? If you want the left on your platform, you have to silence the right. Again, I hope that we have some changes at Twitter and other big social media because it can be a very powerful tool to be able to hear and learn more about things you didn't know. And maybe you might change your mind about something if you're able to hear a different viewpoint.
I agree with that. And I'm sad to hear that about Liz Cheney, a smart person who's very troubled and motivated by hate in a way that's disfiguring her, I would say. Sad. Harmeet Dillon, great to see you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
So all of a sudden, there's a push in the United States Senate to rush 2 European countries next to Russia into NATO. What would be the effects of that? Has anyone thought this through? Probably not. The Senate this week on the verge of approving yet another $40 billion, quote, for Ukraine. So this adds up to escalation of a war most Americans didn't think we were in. What is happening here exactly? We have a right to ask, and we will, with Tulsi Gabbard, who joins us next.
Okay, keep an eye on Tucker Carlson as the evening proceeds. I think he had a fairly commonsensical reaction to what happened in Buffalo. And I think the absurd, hysterical reaction is to say we need less free speech. Like, who on earth would react by saying we need less free speech? So a lot of attacks on Tucker and Fox News over the weekend.
I'm laughing because this is one of about 10 stories that I know you've covered where the government shows preference to people who have shown absolute contempt for our customs, our laws, our system itself, and they're being treated better than American citizens. Now, I know that the left and all the little gatekeepers on Twitter become literally hysterical if you use the term replacement, if you suggest that the Democratic Party is trying to replace the current electorate, the voters now casting ballots, with new people, more obedient voters from the third world. But they become hysterical because that's what's happening, actually. Let's just say it, that's true. If this was happening in your house, if you were in 6th grade, for example, and without telling you, your parents adopted a bunch of new siblings and gave them brand new bikes and let them stay up later and help them with their homework and gave them twice the allowance that they gave you, you would say to your siblings, I think we're being replaced by kids that our parents love more. And it would be kind of hard to argue against you because look at the evidence. So this matters on a bunch of different levels, but on the most basic level, it's a voting rights question. In a democracy, one person equals one vote. If you change the population, you dilute the political power of the people who live there. So every time they import a new voter, I become disenfranchised as a current voter. So I don't understand why we don't understand this. I mean, everyone wants to make a racial issue out of it. Ooh, the white replacement theory. No. This is a voting rights question. I have less political power because they're importing a brand new electorate. Why should I sit back and take that? The power that I have as an American guaranteed at birth is one man, one vote, and they're diluting it. No, they're not allowed to do that. Why are we putting up with this?
Okay, so that's what Tucker Carlson's being attacked for, essentially making the point that the United Nations is all on board with replacement migration. So the Great Replacement, right, is supposed to be a major conspiracy theory, but it's being pushed by the United Nations. Replacement migration, a solution to declining and aging populations. So this UN report says that the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, Korea, Japan, Italy, Germany, and France, they all need replacement migration to offset population decline and population aging resulting from low fertility and mortality rates. United Nations is all on board with replacement migration. So if you call it the Great Replacement, then you're an evil conspiracy theorist. And I don't use that language. I don't believe in that theory. I don't find it helpful. But I don't think the idea is genocidal either. But clearly a lot of our elites are pushing replacement migration, that a lot of Democratic activists are pushing replacement migration. They rejoice that whites who are more likely to vote for Republicans than non-whites in America, that their percentage of the population is steadily decreasing. And so Democrats are ecstatic that America has so much immigration in large part because immigrants largely vote for the left-wing party. So the people has less and less power the more divided the people are. So how do elites rule? Elites rule through pluralism. The people become divided into all sorts of subsections, and then the elites pick off one or two groups with whom they make an alliance. So currently, the elites have an alliance with the high-low against the middle. So The elites dominate the upper classes, and they also dominate the lower classes, and they tag team and team up against the middle. So the more pluralistic society is, the more divided it is, and the less the people can speak with one voice to protest what elites are doing. Populism means that virtue resides with the people, but you don't have a people when your nation is just divided into all these tranches where diversity is regarded as a strength. What does diversity mean? Diversity means that you have very little in common with your next door neighbor and with your fellow resident and fellow citizen. So it would seem to me the more you have in common with the people around you, the more likely you are to form ties with them. That's just an existential fact. So in communities where there is a ton of diversity, you find very little public spiritedness, you find very little volunteering, you find very little social cohesion, you find reduced levels of happiness, you find people kind of tuck their heads in essentially like turtles. They find insular parts of communities where they feel comfortable. Otherwise, they are restrained, they stay at home, they watch a lot of TV. Right. Where do you find the most volunteering in the United States? In the communities that are most white. This isn't because, whites are just so awesome, but people are far more likely to volunteer and to sacrifice and to do kind things for their neighbors if they feel a great deal in common with their neighbors. So, racial identity is just one form of identity. There's also religious identity. There's linguistic identity, right? There are values identity. There are all sorts of different forms of identity. But obviously, the more you have in common with other people, the better your chances of forming friendships with them, and the better the chances are that you will sacrifice for them, and the more likely you are to get along. So replacement migration means increased diversity, increased pluralism, which means the people have less and less power, less and less ability to challenge what the elite's doing. And I'm not a populist. I don't believe the people are always right or even usually right. I mean, I think frequently the elites are right as against the people. So I'm not a populist, but I think that people should be able to speak up.
A few months ago, Russia invaded Ukraine. That's Russia's fault. But you'd have to be an idiot not to ask the context in which this happened. Why did it happen exactly? Well, one of the reasons it happened is because policymakers in the United States kept pushing Ukraine to join NATO. Net benefit to the United States from Ukraine joining NATO, 0. Net benefit to Ukraine, 0. And they knew that, and they kept doing it. And now we have a war. Russia did it, but they did nothing to prevent it. It's getting worse. Now, Mitch McConnell in the United States Senate says that we need, for some reason, to fast-track NATO membership to 2 more nearby countries, Sweden and Finland. Here it is.
We hope to do it as rapidly as possible. Your question is, what as rapidly as possible? And I think certainly we hope to achieve it before the August recess, when Congress typically goes out of session. Obviously, that would be well before the fall election. With regard to the size of the vote, I think it will be very significant, not unanimous, but very significant. NATO was already the most successful military alliance in world history. Now it's going to be even stronger than it was.
Okay, so NATO is the most successful military alliance in world history. Yes, it kept the Soviet Union from invading Western Europe. What is the point of NATO now? Can anyone explain? No. No one can explain. And instead of explaining, we hear demands that NATO expand as rapidly as possible. Damn the consequences and the benefits to the United States. What are the benefits exactly? Again, silence. Republican senators, and of course joining their friends the Democratic side, also plan to send $40 billion to Ukraine immediately. That vote, we believe, is on Wednesday. Of course, we'll fill you in more tomorrow. To promote that bill, Mitch McConnell just toured Kiev, along with Senators Susan Collins of Maine, John Barrasso of Wyoming, and John Cornyn of Texas. Now, you may be wondering, how could they just walk around a war zone like that? Isn't it dangerous? We don't know the answer, but it's certainly interesting. You also might be wondering about priorities here. Why is Congress so focused on Ukraine, but you can't find baby formula? You can't even fill your truck because things, our economy, are declining really rapidly. Don't ask questions. According to Congressman Dan Crenshaw of Texas, asking questions like that, or really any questions at all, thinking you're a citizen, makes you, quote, pro-Russia.
The bad arguments that our side is making is very depressing, and they're almost pro-Russia. People are saying, well, we can't put baby formula on our shelves, but we're sending money to Ukrainians. And my response to that is, you know how much baby formula you can buy with $40 billion? None. None, because it's not a money issue, it's a manufacturing issue. And so we have to solve it with, frankly, telling the FDA to approve safe baby formula and import it from Europe. That'd be one solution. It is not America first when you let Russia and China do whatever they want around the world and establish their version of a global order. That puts America last, because we cannot prosper in a global order led by Russia and China.
Yeah. Do you have any idea what you're talking about, Dan Crenshaw? No. But the point is, anyone who disagrees with Dan Crenshaw is pro-Russia, frankly. Well, frankly, Dan Crenshaw is attempting to deflect from answering obvious questions like why the concern over Ukraine's borders and no concern about the border of your own state, Texas. That's a fair question, not pro-Russia. It's in fact pro-American. Tulsi Gabbard is pro-American, a lifelong Democrat, former presidential candidate. We're always grateful to have her join us tonight. Tulsi Gabbard, thanks so much for coming on. So if you were in the House still, you left after the end of last.
Okay, so a lot of hysterical reactions to the Buffalo shooting, and among the most hysterical, unsurprisingly, is Richard Spencer. So the traits that make Richard Spencer such an exciting live streamer and pundit are also the very traits that make him overall a terrible analyst, a terrible life example, a terrible model, and a terrible leader, because he's so excitable. He's so looking to surf every new wave. He wants to be the bride at every wedding. He wants to be the corpse at every funeral, always needs to be the center of attention. And he has this idea that only he can stop this scourge of white supremacist mass murderers. He wants to end anonymity online. He wants to severely curtail free speech online. Years ago, he said there's not going to be any free speech in the ethno-state. He wants to completely end websites like 4chan. Right? What about websites like Twitch that live streamed this massacre? Doesn't he feel like maybe Twitch has some responsibility? I'm not mad at Twitch. If you put technology out there, people are going to abuse it. So I blame the shooter, and that's where I put my primary blame. But I want to play just a minute here from Richard yesterday.
You discuss some of Nick Fuentes' personality flaws, like having unrealistic views of women in 1950s America. Nick's flaws led to the recent implosion of America. Okay, hold on. Nick's flaws led to the recent implosion of America. I guess he means America First. What are or were your own personality flaws that caused personal and movement setbacks in 2017, 2018? Okay, that's fair. Yeah, I mean, I think I have a degree of narcissism and kind of an arrogant personality. And I want things to be, I think that I'm right and everyone should follow me. I mean, I think I have those types of flaws. I think it's fair to criticize me as such. I do think that, what I was getting at in my podcast monologue discussion of Nick Fuentes, I think there are some really deep flaws within any kind of young alt-right movement, and where people
and many of the flaws that he sees are, of course, that they're in himself. So let's check in with a little bit more here.
And you've been smeared since day one. You've never lost your composure or moved off course, and I definitely admire the way you've handled the attacks. Tulsi Gabbard, thank you.
Thank you.
So for years now, we've taken UFOs seriously. Oh, you're crazy. Take UFOs seriously. Actually, they're worth taking seriously. Kind of a big deal, no? Well, Congress is about to hold the very first public hearing on the question in 50 years. We're going to get a preview of that straight ahead.
Not really worth taking seriously. Okay, so Richard thinks that it's really only him who's standing between us and the end of civilization as we know it. So this is from his race baiting. That's the name of this podcast phone call that he released yesterday.
Background of
talking
I think, again,
to
looking at certain kinds of
people
censorship
on
is partly the right way to go. I think we have to at least consider
Substack.
the impact of earlier waves of censorship in making these borderline people who kind of sympathize with some kind of alt-right agenda go over the edge with frustration, since they have no representation in the public space. Something to think about, at least.
I agree. I mean, it's just a very difficult nut to crack. I would say this about like Brendan Tarrant. I think I said this, and let me reiterate it, and I'll listen to myself and I'll see if I agree with it. I mean, I think I said something fairly provocative back in 2019, and I said, it's either him or me. And what I meant by that is that if you suppress the people who are making legitimate points and are above board and are going to take responsibility for their words and are not going to engage in violence, then, and if you suppress that, then you're going to kind of get a lot of the Brendan Tarrants or who was the other person you mentioned? I forgot his name at the moment.
Robert Bowers.
Robert Bowers, exactly, who shot up the temple, Jewish temple. I guess, was that 2019 as well, or 2018? I think it was 2018. Anyway, a few years ago. And that's a rather provocative thing to say. It almost sounds like a threat, but I do think it carries some weight. I mean, these serious issues need to be articulated, and just suppressing like rational discourse, it does lead these people to conclude.
Yeah, but Richard, you want to suppress a lot of this discourse. I mean, come on. How many people really think that it's just Richard Spencer standing between us and the apocalypse? How about some real talk and some sober talk on these mass shootings? Number one, they're exceedingly rare in a country of 330 million people. They account for a very small percentage of the overall murder rate. There is not an epidemic of white supremacists going out there and murdering people. That far more people of color murder white people and rape white people than white people are out there murdering and raping people of color. So if you just want to look at like racial victims of crime, right? Blacks are the most victimized group, primarily victimized by other blacks, right? Which racial group is killing the overwhelming majority of black murder victims? It's fellow blacks. So ideology doesn't really play much of a role in mass shootings, right? This has been studied pretty extensively. Fewer than 5% of these mass shooters have a history of involuntary mental commitment or some kind of adjudication of dangerousness that would have prohibited them from purchasing a firearm. Overall, these people with serious mental illness do seem to be overrepresented among mass shooters, but this does not imply that serious mental illness causes mass shooters, just as we cannot conclude that being a young man causes mass shootings. I'm reading from academic survey, a meta-analysis of the literature. So past decade has seen an increase in the percentage of mass public shootings that are related to fame seeking and sometimes on behalf of a broader ideology. So perhaps this somewhat small rise in fame and attention-seeking motivations among mass public shooters has contributed to escalation in the lethality of these incidents. But overall, there's very little evidence that mass shooters tend to be politically motivated, right? Most descriptors of the partisanship of individual shooters is highly speculative. It comes from, very early reports. Generally speaking, mass shooters are rarely motivated by a political agenda. They rarely have a coherent political agenda. Brendan Tarrant didn't have a coherent political agenda. This guy, Peyton Gandron, he didn't have a coherent political agenda. He was all over the map from left to right. Right? Mass shootings tend to be perpetrated by young men who are socially isolated, right? They experience something, a trauma or a conflict that sends them reeling emotionally, and then they have easy access to guns. But their motivations are almost always, without exception, non-political. Right? Now, some will channel their rage at a specific group of people, but they're virtually never acting on any kind of Republican or Democratic, conservative or liberal mission. Right? Very few mass shooters are motivated by any sort of political agenda. Right? They might be anti-gay, they might be anti-black, they might be anti-white, they might be anti-Christian, and you can call those political, but they're certainly not partisan. So usually these beliefs, to the extent they have any coherence, come out of personal vendettas. They don't usually come out of political propaganda. So most school shooters are children who wouldn't know a conservative from a communist. So the whole idea of associating politics with these mass murderers is absolutely absurd. It has nothing to do with it. There's absolutely no evidence to show that mass killings are motivated by political ideologies of any type. All the mass killings we have seen have been motivated by some kind of lethal combination of a small subgroup of mental illnesses combined with easy accessibility to weapons of mass killing during peak symptoms of these illnesses. But Richard thinks that only he can save us.
It almost sounds like a threat, but I do think it carries some weight. I mean, these serious issues need to be articulated, and just suppressing like rational discourse, it does lead these people to conclude that like, well, nothing can be done. You know, the alt-right failed and Trump just lost the midterms to boot. And so, you know, to hell with it, I'm just going to go murder a bunch of Jews in order to make my case. And, you know, I mean, you can, I don't know. I think my argument kind of carried some weight. Now, I have a different perspective on it now as time goes on. I obviously do agree that we need to, you know, put these things into the public square. I might even go a little bit further at this point and say that you know, we recognize that we're going against the grain in a very hard way. I mean, we are dissidents on some basic level. And maybe the movement at this point in time needs to be a little esoteric, as it were, that just, you know, the people are not quite ready for this. And we need to.
So great news, guys. Richard is ready to save us. You just have to join him at a higher level of readiness, right? The fault's with you, right? Richard is here. The teacher is ready. He just needs the student to appear.
Kind of, and I do agree with this at the very least. We need to do a lot more just intellectual work to make sure that we're getting it right. And that, you know, we really have something to say, because when you push a lot of this stuff into the public square, as I was saying with Ed, it almost gets to the point where like shooting blacks randomly is almost like a rational thing to do. And obviously, I hope no one clips that last sentence I just said, because it needs to be put in context. I obviously don't think it is. But if the movement is solely based on just like pure numbers, and these occupiers have come here, none of them are innocent, in the words of you know, the Buffalo shooter, and it's just about they're occupying our land. It's like Russian tanks in Ukraine or something. Just kill them. You know, it's a numbers game. You know, this Buffalo shooter, what did he kill? 10 or a dozen? Or, you know, it's like, oh, the score now is I'm in jail and 10 blacks and maybe some whites are dead. They were probably liberals. You know, we won this round. I mean, that kind of horrible logic starts to enter the realm when the entire argument is just basically just like pure numbers, just a numbers game. That's it. And so I do think that maybe the movement needs to be a bit esoteric, and we kind of have to recognize that we're on the margins and that we're dissident, and we need to kind of pursue what we're doing in a certain way. I tend to agree with that. I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but I tend to agree with that, you know, after saying it. But also, it's like the worst aspect of our movement can be taken.
Okay, let's see how the left is dealing with setbacks in the whole Roe v. Wade potential ruling coming out from the Supreme Court.
Centuries of tradition and law by leaking Sam Alito's draft opinion, in which he argued for overturning Roe v. Wade. Abortion enthusiasts have harassed Supreme Court justices and their families at home. They've attacked police officers in LA. They firebombed a pro-life group in Wisconsin. On Sunday, Planned Parenthood held a, quote, pro-abortion protest at the Arizona State Capitol. Remember safe, legal, and rare? No, not anymore. They're just for it now, and they're saying it. The journalist Drew Hernandez attended that protest and shot some pretty shocking footage of the people who were there. Here's a sample.
Keep your laws out of my Keep your laws out of my
It doesn't make sense. You're contradicting yourself.
Their baby
Coat hanger Dodger. Coat hanger Dodger. That means your mom stuck a coat hanger up her hooey and tried to get rid of you, but she failed.
abolish abortion. We
Roe v. Wade.
Roe v. Wade.
You guys want to stand up? You want to stand up?
To get in the world.
We're for women's rights.
To get in the world. You've killed
no matter what. Every month when you have a menstrual cycle, you're killing. Yes, it is. It's DNA.
You don't have to be a religious person to see that there's a spiritual component to all of this. Allison Senofante is a pro-life advocate. She joins us. Allison, thanks so much for coming on. So this doesn't seem like we've left the realm of a political debate or even a debate over rights and moved into another realm entirely.
Yeah, what you just played is so hard to watch, right, Tucker? Because it's human beings treating human beings the worst. But yet, time and time again, pro-life individuals go out, they try and make the case for life. They are willing to take this verbal beating, this verbal harassment, because someone who suffers more than that pro-life individual out on the streets is the preborn child. That is what we're fighting for in the pro-life movement. Every single child lost to abortion is violated. They are dismembered and poisoned and starved of nutrition. And so that's why these pro-lifers keep going out, trying to make the case, keep trying to have the debate. That anger, that vitriol is not going to change anyone's heart or mind. But yet we on the pro-life movement are still showing up. We're trying to serve them. Education. I mean, listen, some of the things that were just said, they're not even medically accurate. I mean, these people need a lesson in science, in prenatal development, embryology. They're just completely wrong. And I really feel for a lot of these young women because they've been lied to, Tucker. They've been lied to by big media, big abortion, Planned Parenthood, who tell them these things that are lies. And so I'm really glad you're covering this, and I'm really grateful for a diverse pro-life movement.
Okay, so maybe Richard Spencer will save us from all this madness.
By very mainstream people, whether it's like Tucker Carlson or whether it's 4chan, where you find this all over the place. And it can be just kind of dumbed down or perverted or just said in such blunt terms that it just becomes this kind of terrible numbers game. Very similar to like some of the BLM stuff where you had mentally ill, crazed blacks, and they were like, well, all cops are bastards. Oh, well, okay, then I'm just going to go shoot a cop. Fuck it. I don't know. I mean, I don't have a direct solution to this, but I just think we need to be talking about this. And it's like, is our movement, is the world ready for what we're saying? I mean, I think we should at least ask that question and stop thinking in terms of
I don't know. Are you ready for what you're saying? You said that your Hailgate almost destroyed you. I mean, is the movement that you created attracting high quality people, or is there a problem internally, or are all the problems just external to you and the movement?
The normies are becoming radicalized, or the normies are coming around or whatever. Well, yeah, they are. They might be coming around in a really horrible way and in a really perverse way. We need to pay attention to that. And then the
normies are not coming around in a perverse way and going out and slaughtering people, right? These mass murder events are exceedingly rare. They make up a very tiny proportion of murders in the United States.
Other thing is that, I've talked a little bit about this before. I mean, the potential for bad faith actors to manipulate forums or social networks like Facebook or 4chan or whatever is clear. I don't think that
people did not evolve to be gullible, all right? People are not as easily manipulated to do things that they don't want to do, right? You don't have bad actors out there propagandizing people through a few $1,000s worth of Facebook ads or through making some posts on 4chan. Right? We evolved in a way to be highly suspicious of what other people tell us because that's in our best interest. We also evolved in a way that we tend to have disproportionate certainty over our own opinions, right? Because there are evolutionary benefits to going through life with a ton of confidence. But we can kind of straighten out some of the stupid things that we believe when we think socially, like I'm doing right now. I'm talking to you, you're talking to me back in the chat. I have guests who come on. When I say something, I can be held accountable for it. I learn from the experience, I think, much more clearly when I think socially rather than just try to think on my own.
Kremlin or Putin invented QAnon or anything like that. But did it in this kind of indirect way support Russia? Yes. Was it kind of similar to the Red Army faction in some weird way? Yes. It was demoralizing, created extreme chaos and terror among the population. I mean, I don't doubt that on some level there's some Russian troll farm that's pushing something like Q or did push it. And then just
QAnon did not depend on some Russian troll farm, right? Conspiracy theories meet certain needs in people who are losers at life, right? Everyone wants to feel special. Everyone wants to feel important. Now, me, I've evolved so much spiritually that I'm happy to wear a dark shirt against a dark background and just simply fade away and simply allow the power of my ideas to either win the day or lose the day because it's not about me. I'm just like a selfless servant of the light.
Add on to that the issue of like, we agree, free speech is, at least our notion of it, free speech is like political speech. Like you are allowed to disagree with people. And I support that, everyone supports that. It's kind of easy. But free speech isn't like pornography. We've had laws and regulations of pornography. I think we should have more regulations of pornography. And like, I don't know. I mean, the 13-year.
Look, there's no strong correlation between the amount of pornography that's allowed in a society and the amount of heinous things that could be possibly linked to pornography, such as violence and rape. Right? Japan has abundant access to pornography, to video games, to TV, to cable TV, all right, to all the things that are supposed to turn people into, psycho murder machines. And Japan has infinitesimal rates of violence. So I don't doubt that TV and video games and pornography can warp and disturb a mind that is already leaning in that direction. But pornography and video games and 4chan and anonymity on the internet is not the major source of our murder problems, right? America's murder problems are replicated around the world when you look at the demographics of who's committing the murders. So America's racial problems are not American. They're replicated all around the world when you have the same sort of components that America has. So Swedes who come to America are not committing high rates of crime. Japanese and Chinese who come to America are not creating, high rates of murder. All right, the same people who commit a lot of murders in England or in Australia or in Africa or in Central or South America are also committing a high rate of murders in the United States. So there's nothing really unique about America's racial problem. It simply replicates what's going on around the world. We just have different demographics than most other first world industrialized nations.
10-year-old girl who kills herself because she doesn't measure up to some Instagram model with big tits who's, taking amazing photographs in her vacation in Cancun and, whatever. And this girl feels that she's totally inadequate and just offs herself at a very, vulnerable time in her life. I mean, this is.
If a girl offs herself because she's on Instagram during a vulnerable period of her life and sees women more beautiful than her, that has almost nothing to do with Instagram. That's almost everything to do with that girl and her lack of connection, right? If she was happily connected to family and friends and community, if she had some kind of transcendent purpose in life, if she was connected to some sort of volunteering where she was playing an essential role in the lives of others, she wouldn't be out there offing herself. So it's so easy to blame Instagram or Twitch or 4chan when disconnected people do crazy things.
This is a really bad thing. And this is something that's new to the world. It's serious. It's just, even if a girl doesn't commit suicide, it is pretty toxic. Like, teenagers have enough problems, but like getting depressed over some stupid bitch on Instagram.
Plenty of people read 4chan every day, and it has no discernible negative effect on them. Millions and millions of people use Facebook and Twitter and Instagram every day. It has no discernible ill effect, right? So maybe 2% of the population, 5% of the population uses social media and it has some kind of ill effect. Yeah, it has an ill effect on people who are mentally unstable, people who lack that real life connection. So they are trying to fill a hole in their soul with virtual connection. And there are forms of virtual connection that are elevating and virtuous and make you wiser and kinder. I mean, it's good to have a life that's filled with love. I mean, love changes your brain. I mean, even love of baseball. Right? There's this great new book out called Wired for Love, a neuroscientist's journey through romance, loss, and the essence of human connection. So she met a guy when she was 37, and they got married. He was a fellow scientist, and then he died of cancer in 2018. And so she felt the euphoria that comes from falling in love. She got the rush of dopamine. She got the adrenaline, right? There are a lot of wonderful things about falling in love. And love's important, right? Love should not be forgotten.
Kamala Harris, because why wouldn't you? It's just too easy. Even old boyfriend Willie Brown doesn't like Kamala Harris anymore. But Kamala Harris, one thing you can say for her is she is underrated as a philosophical voice. She could literally do a page-a-day calendar, a kind of Khalil Gibran for our time. Remember, it was Kamala Harris who once pointed out, and we're quoting, "It is time for us to do what we have been doing, and that time is every day." In other words, today is the first day of the rest of your life. Children, are our future. Now, we didn't think she could get better than that, but we underestimated her, as we so often have. Here she is, Kamala Harris, our page-a-day calendar vice president, speaking to the State Department, telling us about the importance of working together.
Our world is increasingly more interconnected and interdependent. That is especially true when it comes to the climate crisis, which is why we will work together and continue to work together to address these issues, to tackle these challenges, and to work together as we continue to work operating from the new norms, rules, and agreements that we will convene to work together on to galvanize global action.
So if you were to take a truckload of cliches and put them in a blender, that's what you get. Congratulations, Kamala Harris. We'll see you tomorrow. Have the best night with the ones you love.
Yeah. Love's where it's at. So a terrific book out by a neuroscientist. And it's written up in the New York Times. What happens when you fall in love? All right. It feels really good. Our brain releases feel-good neurotransmitters that boost our mood. We have, biological fireworks going off. Our heart rate is elevated, right? You get euphoric. You get that rush of dopamine. You blush, which is a sign of adrenaline. We become closer. We get closer physically, spiritually. We start imitating each other. We're activating our mirror neurons, the network of brain cells that are activated when you move or feel something or when you see another person moving, right? All sorts of great things happen when you fall in love. When you form strong connections, right? Our whole system becomes boosted, right? Our heart rate gets elevated. We get the love hormone, oxytocin starts rising. It makes us feel connected, right? Our hormones and neurotransmitters like norepinephrine spiking. We lose track of time. Our levels of adrenaline rise, which expands the capillaries in our cheeks. That's what makes us flush. Our levels of serotonin, which is a key hormone in regulating appetite and intrusive, anxious thoughts, starts going down. When we're in love, we start eating irregularly. We fixate on small details. We worry about sending the perfect text, saying the perfect words. Then we start to calm down, right? We start to feel content, right? We have more complex cognitive functions that take off, such as pain suppression. We have more compassion. We have better memory. We have greater creativity when we fall in love. So love is a superpower that makes the brain thrive. It's necessary for survival, like water, exercise, or food. A healthy love life, having a close circle of friends, right, absolutely is essential to your health as a good diet. So love is the opposite of loneliness, right? And loneliness is what characterizes these mass shooters. It's what characterizes most antisocial behavior, right? Loneliness is accompanied by a cascade of physical and mental disabilities, from depression to high blood pressure to diabetes to sleep fragmentation. So if you don't feel like you're in meaningful relationships, you are thirsty. You're socially thirsty. So your brain is sending you signals to tell you that you need to help your social body. So these alarms get activated when people are literally thirsty and when you're just feeling socially disconnected from others. And these feelings are here to help us to survive. So there's a paradox in loneliness. We want to approach others, but the lonely mind has been lonely for so long that it detects more threats, often inaccurately, and that makes you want to withdraw rather than approach others. And love doesn't have to be with a living person. It can be with a fantastic, charismatic live streamer. If you're really in love with life, with your passions, with your hobbies, all right, that can be a tremendous buffer against loneliness. When I'm thinking about books I'm reading, if I'm thinking about ideas, if I'm thinking about music, all right, if I'm thinking about my friends, if I'm thinking about family, all right, that fills me with passion, and I'm not lonely when I'm filled with passion. And you can also stay connected with other people even if you're not physically in the same vicinity. If you simply close your eyes, think about someone you love. Think about when you made them laugh out loud, right? Think about the kindness that other people have done for you. Like, we can store these positive memories in our mind. We can access them anytime. We have the remote control. We can choose to flip on a channel in our brain that's all about love and forgiveness, that's about connection and gratitude, right? It's a much healthier place to live.
Instagram, I mean, give me a break. There just has to be something. We have to at least, talk about this, of like how we regulate the internet. And like 4chan just strikes me as just extremely fucking toxic. And like, it's filled with snuff videos.
Yeah, there's a lot that is toxic on 4chan. There's also a lot of great stuff on 4chan. It's a mixed bag. I don't find it good for me, so I don't spend much time there. But it's a mixed bag. It's not like simply a den of evil.
And when I say 4chan, I mean that as kind of a catch-all term. 8chan, 8kun, whatever. And other ones in Asia that I don't even know the names of. It just strikes me as extremely toxic. It's filled with, snuff videos, child porn, weird anime shit, and then all of its contributions to discourse, you can actually find elsewhere. It's not like some new, powerful idea emerged on 4chan. Like, what emerges on 4chan are just kind of dumbed down meme versions of stuff that you can really find elsewhere. And so I don't know. I mean, I'm just bored with the argument of, because I think it's illegitimate, and I'm bored of just saying we want free speech. Well, of course I want free speech. I want to participate in discourse. I guess you guys do as well, and you're in maybe a different way than I do.
That's a telling moment. Richard finds support for free speech boring because he always wants to be new and shocking and innovative and surprising and compelling. And in his desire to be new and exciting and compelling and to blow your mind with his hot takes, he just gets bored with good old-fashioned free speech, common sense. A lot of things that are good in life are not exciting. In fact, for most people, you want to live just a few notches above boring, right? You don't want to be out there pursuing excitement.
Or maybe not. But, you do have to take responsibility for your words, and you do have to make distinctions between someone who is trying to contribute to discourse and just some, toxic, what did Obi-Wan Kenobi say about Mos Eisley? There's never been a worse den of vipers or something like this.
So Richard had Mark Brahman on his show yesterday. So Mark starts going off.
You know what I mean? So I don't know though. I mean, it's hard to say exactly. I mean, we obviously don't know ultimately what's in the heart of all these people, but I think that they are reactive and emotional. So they are reactionaries. Guys like Tucker Carlson, I think he's basically a reactionary. You know what I mean? I think the same was true of Trump, that he was a reactionary. And I don't think that, so it's a kind of emotional response to irritations, present in the society. But it's not an intellectual response and therefore it doesn't sustain, right? So in other words, it doesn't, because it's emotional and it's reactive, it's inconsistent and it doesn't sustain, right? And there's no plan. They don't have a plan. They're just kind of lashing out in a kind of in a semi-mindless manner. I mean,
okay, this is Mark Brahman's critique of the dissident right, saying the dissident right, the problem with the dissident right is it doesn't have a plan.
They're not mindless themselves, obviously. A lot of them are very intelligent, but their politics is a kind of emotive, reactive politics that's lacking a plan or a kind of direction or vision or structure.
Well, populism is inherently reactive. Okay, populism is about virtue resides with the people. It's not really an ideology. It's entirely situational. It never lasts, all right? Populism is always a fleeting movement, right? You don't have populists with long careers. You don't have populist institutions. Populism is an intermittent phenomena where the people feel a sense of commonality and they unite and rebel against the reigning elites.
Sure, you know what I mean? And that makes it distinct, of course, from the left, or from elements of the left, and it certainly makes it distinct from Jews who do have a plan. You know what I mean?
Wow, Jews do have a plan. Did you know that? I mean, I converted to Judaism 30 years ago. I didn't realize we have a plan. I mean, Jews have almost nothing in common with each other, except for we have concerns about people who hate Jews. Aside from that, Jews have virtually nothing in common with each other. Like Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews have virtually nothing in common. Orthodox Jews and left-wing secular Jews have almost nothing in common. Orthodox Jews and members of the conservative Judaism denomination have almost nothing in common. So this idea that Jews have a plan, right? Jews have a plan as much as Australians have a plan and Japanese have a plan and Anglicans have a plan. Did you know Anglicans have a plan, guys? And maybe the distant right should be more like the Anglicans, because, the Anglicans really have that ultimate plan.
But so I think that's what we're seeing a lot in right-wing politics is not and again, it's easy to say that they're grifting, and on some level they are grifting, but I think that it's on some level it's also a kind of unconscious grifting, right? In other words, that Charlie Kirk is really Charlie Kirk on some level, you know what I mean? And he's not of course he's being cautious in some cases and that sort of thing, and where no one is being completely direct 100% of the time, right? But I think that that basically what you see on the right to a certain extent is what you get, in that they're, I mean, it's not, they don't have a plan, they're reactionaries, it's an emotive response, and that in contrast to the leading element of the left, which would be Jews and Judaism, which is intelligent and does come from the logos and does have a plan.
Yeah, the leading element of the left, except for when it's not a leading element on the left. All right, Jews have a disproportionate role in many ideological endeavors because they tend to have high average IQs. But Jews don't have any more disproportionate role on the left than they have in physics, in chess. All right, half of the major chess champions have been Jewish because chess is a very high IQ occupation. So Americans with IQs above genius level, above 145, about a third of them are, somewhere between a third and half of them are Ashkenazi Jews, right? So you would expect that they would have a disproportionate role in intellectual endeavors, whether these endeavors are on the left or on the right. Now, historically, the left has been much more friendly to Jews than the right, right? The right has traditionally stood for blood and soil and fear of outsiders and those who are different. So Jews have, in the past 200 years, not generally been as accepted and welcomed on the right as they have been on the left.
They're obviously going to lose that battle, but it also, I think it explains a sort of inconsistency of their rhetoric, right? So in other words, Tucker is like reacting to like immigration and shit like that in demographics, but that's not like, if that really, because obviously, Richard has articulated views about this, but I think that ultimately, everyone here agrees that demographics is destiny, but it's not the whole picture in the sense that you need a direction, or you need a logos, you need something.
It's like build a wall, deport them all, but why? Why do you want to deport them all? They won't answer that.
You need a kind of vision for society, right. I think that but if Tucker Carlson really had a vision for society, then he wouldn't be just kind of reacting to the news cycle in this sort of like Archie Bunker type way. Like the guy would be moving in a more kind of coherent way and in a more consistent way. And
Tucker has about as much of a vision as you can expect from a TV host. He's written a couple of pretty good books. He puts out some thoughtful and some ridiculous shows. The man has a definite ethos, an ideology. He wants a more coherent society with less immigration and less free trade and more respect for traditional ways of human organization. So I think this critique is unfair.
And probably he would. And he would also be more explicit. But I think he's being. Honestly, I think he's being. I think that he is what you get. Like I don't think that there's another Tucker Carlson behind Tucker Carlson. Maybe he's more radical, but I don't think he's. I think he ultimately does see kind of a civ-nat like Republican.
It does not speak well of Richard Spencer that he's close with Mark Brauman. Mark Brauman just doesn't have any useful insights and has a ton of stupid and bad insights.
As the solution, and that we just got to get people on board with the program. We just got to get people signed up with the program. It's like that shit, that's not going to work. You know what I mean? Things, society's already done. You know what I mean? We have to start thinking about the next thing. You know what I mean? And so that's my reading of the situation. And most of the left also is earnest, of course, as well. But I think that the element that has a vision, to their credit, and has a plan is the Jewish element. Ultimately, that they are thinking, generationally. They're thinking into the future, and they realize that this civilization is not going to be around forever, right? So they're thinking about what's next, and we have to kind of be thinking along those terms as well.
Anglicans think about what's next, right? Muslims think about what's next. Buddhists, Baha'i think about what's next. Secular people and atheists think about what's next. It's not some uniquely Jewish phenomenon.
More, intergenerational way, right?
Yes.
Would it be fair to say that vision is the most sought after superpower? Isn't the whole story of Dune about vision?
Yes. We need to get.
And who has that?
From Dune.
What type of personality has vision?
Lacks a vision. It lacks a guiding vision. And
isn't the whole story of Dune? That's where we should get, our transcendence from movies like Dune.
So they are also reactionary, and that was certainly true of Fuentes, right?
Who was that just speaking? These are various callers from Richard Spencer's Substack. If you join Richard Spencer's Substack, he has twice weekly calls where you can ask him questions.
So it's a problem generally, but I think it's less of a problem in the more dissident circles. Or in some cases they have a vision, but it's not really a tenable vision, or it's not a desirable vision, right? So
I would say that a man with vision would not play 4D chess. He would play 3D.
The problem with the alt-right is not a lack of vision. It's a lack of quality, right? The movement has overwhelmingly attracted really poor quality people. That's the fundamental problem. There's been vision galore. Everybody on the alt-right wants to be a visionist, to be a thought leader, to go on podcasts and to host live streams. Everybody on the alt-right has a vision for you. That's not the problem with the distant right.
Continent-wide imperium. It is a really big idea, and it's true inequality. The state is unquestionably an important idea, but the ethno-state kind of suffers perhaps from almost like a little too much vision. It's similar to a communist who's like, well, once we establish true socialism, there will be no division of labor, and thus there will be no true inequality. There will be kind of a diversity of preference, but no real equality. It's so big, at least the way that I imagine it, which is a continent-wide imperium. It is a really big idea, and it's kind of something to shoot for. I think what Mark is saying, also in vision and connecting with logos, or even what Brendan's saying, is like, how to play chess. You're not playing some secret game in the fourth dimension. You're playing actual chess, and you know what to sacrifice and how to win. And I do think that, I did put the ethno-state out there, and I'm glad it's out there for discourse, but it was misunderstood to some degree. I think petty nationalists might have adopted it as an ethno-state, for them. But also it's quite big. And what we actually need is like a logical, coherent way of thinking that will ultimately lead to that, and where we can properly analyze world events as either good or bad for that agenda. And so I think there does have to be a kind of logos. We can't, I guess I'm rightly criticized when they're just like, well, Richard just wants the Roman Empire. Like, all right, what are you going to do? Like, just go declare yourself, dictator and, create this out of your imagination. I mean, I think that's a kind of legit criticism. Something like the ethno-state can only arise when there is a logical coherence to our thought.
Yeah, the ethno-state was misunderstood as a geographic territory instead of a mental headspace. But if you look at Vatican City, which is a sovereign state, population 500 something citizens, their influence goes outside their walls to every church in the world that's Catholic. So the ethno-state is not really a place; it's in the mind. And the idea that you have to carve out some part of New England and live in the backwaters in abject poverty just to be sovereign and powerful is completely backwards to what an ethno-state would mean.
Yes, we always get this of like, let's all move to Idaho. Don't you live in Idaho, Brendan?
I'm in Boise, actually.
Oh, you're in Boise. Okay. Yeah. Well, I've never visited Boise. That might be an interesting. I heard Boise is a really fun place.
It is. The traffic prices, housing prices, everything's skyrocketing.
Well, of course. Yeah. I'm just saying to go visit.
Oh, yeah, it's beautiful territory. Yeah. If you want to do outdoor stuff, you go here.
Yeah. But anyway, there's always this tendency among white nationalists of like, let's all move to Boise, or let's all move to Montana. Let's go take over Iowa. The libertarians did this as well. I don't know if this project is going anywhere. I think they were moving to Iowa. And the idea, or New Hampshire rather. So the idea was that all libertarians around the country will move to New Hampshire, and then they'll elect a libertarian Republican in the primary, and then just kind of change the game. So they'll come out of nowhere and elect Ron Paul in New Hampshire, who'll win New Hampshire and be ahead in delegates, and then everyone will be reeling. I mean, it's a somewhat plausible premise, but anyway, I think the white nationalists. I mean, again, I'm not against people living near each other. I think actually we'd be really productive if Mark and I were next door neighbors or something. But nevertheless, I do think it's the wrong way of thinking. As you were saying, like the ethno-state is a state of mind as much as it is an actual existing state. You can say the Vatican, the Soviet Union, at least in its heyday. I mean, it was materially less well off than this other superpowers, but like ideologically, just like invading people's hopes and dreams, basically, it was immensely powerful.
Sure, or Marxism or Christianity, or right. So,
but then, exactly.
The idea though is that it takes a physical manifestation. So,
So what do Richard and Mark Brahman really believe in? REM theory, Apolloism, just a watered down version really of
Before we discuss this perhaps exotic idea of Apolloism, some viewers might wonder, why not Christianity? Why isn't a return to Christian worship the answer to our civilizational crisis? After all, if the West is to continue in any salubrious form, or indeed rejuvenate itself and attain even greater heights, should it not seek to return to the faith Europeans held for the last 1600 years? A faith that became familiar to them, that became, in many ways, integral to their very identity. perhaps the first and most obvious question, is Christianity true? Most Christians take the miracles depicted in the New Testament as factual events that occurred, and moreover, that belief in the reality of miracles, especially the resurrection of Jesus, is requisite for being a Christian.
Okay, most Christians don't think deeply about the reality of miracles, right? Christianity, like Judaism, like Islam, is primarily something you inherit from your parents, and it's what you grow up in, and it's just what's normal and natural. For most Christians, as for most Jews, as for most Muslims, their quote-unquote religion is primarily a social club and a way of signaling to other people that you're a good person, right? So this idea that most Christians believe in the literal miracles is absurd. Most Christians are not thinking deeply about theological matters. They're not thinking deeply about miracles, right? Most quote-unquote religious people are not thinking deeply about religion. It is a social club.
Christian. In contrast, REM theorists understand the miracles described in the New Testament to be fictions, symbolic or parabolic in meaning, with no real plausibility or historical truth to them. For this reason, REM theorists consider Christ at best a semi-mythical figure, perhaps modeled on a historical figure.
So is Plato's allegory of the cave, is that just, stupid and backward and regressive because it didn't literally happen, right? There are all sorts of allegories and parables in history which contain, profound messages. So whether or not, this particular event described in this or that sacred text, literally happened just as the text described, is not terribly important for how people tend to lead their lives, right? If you can get some kind of valuable lesson or inspiration, then that's wonderful, right? It doesn't have to be literally true. But still, people don't lead their lives on metaphysics, right? And I'm looking at a comment here I got from Philip DeReese. Luke confuses mere descriptive propositions. People tend to love their children, their friends, their in-groups. With normative ones, people ought to love their children, their friends, their in-groups. Well, guess what? Normative prescriptions that are not backed up by social sanctions don't have any power or influence, right? Metaphysics is not accompanied by behavioral changes, generally speaking, right? You may find an individual here, an individual there who can go off with a whole new brand of metaphysics and change his behavior, but you can't get a lot of people doing that. People behave as the people around them reward them for behaving. So Philip says, from the mere fact that you can observe certain things about what people tend to do, people tend to love their children, they tend to love their friends, they tend to love their in-group, then not even those tendencies necessarily hold true universally. Of course, doesn't logically follow that they actually ought to do those things or that they have any rational justification for doing them. Yeah, we developed over time, all right? The only way that we're still here is because we tend to naturally love our kids and to want to care for our kids. Believing that mere descriptions equate with normativity is otherwise known as the naturalistic fallacy. I don't talk much about normativity. I don't talk about what we ought to do. I talk about how we do behave. It is precisely for this reason that metaphysics is essential to any talk of love, morality, meaning, or purpose. Metaphysics is an intellectual form of masturbation. It doesn't make any real-world difference, except to the extent that pursuing a particular type of metaphysics may lead you to associate with a particular community, right? So if you're one of those rare birds who's really into metaphysics, right, you will want to go hang out with other people who believe in your metaphysics, then their rewards and punishments will shape your behavior. So Philip says, because one's metaphysical beliefs and values or lack thereof determine how one can or cannot establish normative justifications for the things one ought to do. Yeah, none of that matters in the real world. I understand it's compelling, intellectual masturbation. I get it. Hence, this makes all the difference in the world, right? This makes all the difference in the world between a person who affirms metaphysics and another who scoffs at it, between religious worldviews and cultural systems and secular ones. Well, show me the difference. Where's the evidence? There isn't any evidence, right? Religious people there's no clear moral distinction between the behavior of religious people and secular people and atheist people, right? There's no difference. The one difference that you can discern is that religious people tend to have in-group identities and tend to treat their in-group better than the average person treats the average person. But as far as out-groups, religious people don't treat out-groups any better, any differently than non-religious people. Philip says, this doesn't even touch on the fact that one must also in the first place define what love even means in terms of its contents and substance. Is love an emotion? Is it an action? Is it an attitude? Guess what? It's all of those. Making those determination, yet again, inescapably involves metaphysics. Yeah, if you like to masturbate, you can examine the metaphysics of love. But if you want to deal in reality, you may want to check out this new book, Wired for Love, Neuroscientist's Journey Through Romance, Loss, and the Essence of Human Connection.
So that the body is formed from the mind. So, not immediately, obviously. But I think that is one of the, that's one of the, the DR, the alt-right, is largely a kind of populist movement, at least in terms of its mentality. I mean, the difficulty there is that it doesn't really, which I've said like numerous times, is it doesn't have access to the populists. So it can't really be a populist movement lacking that access. It doesn't have like Trump's soapbox. So I think that, but there is this kind of, because of that sort of populist mentality, and really, I mean, I think that, a lot of it is they're stuck on ideas, or just sort of models of the early 20th century, we could say. They're sort of stuck on some of these models. Their imagination is sort of stuck on some of these models. And I think that the hope is that there'll be some demagogue that will emerge and he'll have access, whether through his abilities or through, wealth or, wealthy people conspiring. He'll have access to this podium and gain access to the populace as Hitler did. Theoretically, that is a scenario. I mean, Trump was, people had this hope that he was something that he was not, right? And there also could be, people who are essentially like Trojan horses or that.
Guess what? We all have hopes that someone else is something that we're not. We all have delusions about other people because we interpret them through our own perspective, where we want to make sense of how they're acting. People act and speak in ways completely contradictory to our conceptions of other people, but it's too much bother to try to reconcile that or to face up to it. So we just decide in our mind, Joe's a good person, Jack's a bad person, Jeff is a brave person, Karen is a coward. We all have these explanations for people that we know, and we tend to be quite impervious to the reality of how they act and how they really speak. People are far more complicated than we want to give them credit for. We usually, for most people in our lives, we only interact with them in certain situations, and we think that our interactions with someone, say at the cash register or at church or at a Rotary Club or at a strip club, that this is somehow representative of their totality. But no, people are situational, right? People change when you change the situation. So I am, far more complicated than the persona who does a YouTube live stream. You're far more complicated than your persona at work or your persona at shul or your persona in your volunteer organization, right? So in some situations, you would consider me brave. In lots of other situations, you would consider me cowardly. In some situations, you would consider me honest. In other situations, you'd consider me a liar, right? No one is universally a truth teller, a brave person, a good person, right? Those people that you admire, there are all sorts of situations where you would despise how they act, right? There's no one who is immune to the power of situation. Everyone is incredibly vulnerable. Everyone has an incredible number of frailties. So everybody in our life, we have delusions about. And usually we have delusions in the direction of consistency. We attribute far more consistency to ourselves and to other people than's really there. We're constantly reinterpreting the story of our life to make it consistent, right? If we act out in a way contrary to our values, we quickly justify it and then fit it into our life story so that we look heroic.
Sort of thing. But the idea is a kind of populist model, with a dictator and that sort of thing. I think that, and what they've really been against is this idea of like, well, we're not going to do a kind of slow march through the institutions like the Jews did, for example, right? Now, I think that we have to accept that this is going to take.
Jews didn't do a slow march through the institutions. once Jews were allowed to go to university, they did a really fast march through the institutions. They exploded into the institutions. As soon as they were allowed into institutions, they poured into institutions, and they dominated according to the degree that you would expect with their average levels of IQ and their levels of secular education. So there's no slow Jewish march through the institutions, just like right now there's a considerable diminishment of Jewish power and influence in many institutions as other groups such as Indian Americans, Southeast Asians, Northeast Asians are pouring into America's major institutions such as Wall Street.
Generations. And it's not that things could happen in the interim that are very fortuitous and very helpful to our cause. Political things could happen. Political people could come to power. People that either that we know that we assist and help, or people who are kind of outside of our sphere could come to power and be very beneficial to the things that we're trying to accomplish. But we have to think about this in terms of generations as a kind of eternal thing that goes on after we die, effectively. And that, so this idea of a slow march through the Jews had the abidance and the kind of sense of prophecy, and they had a plan. So they were willing to kind of do this slow march through the institutions. So that is imitable in its way. Now, again, I think that we have to be prepared.
Jews had a plan for a slow march through institutions? No. Jews are comprised of individuals, and there are Orthodox Jews who often have fairly traditional values, and there are secular Jews who often have fairly radical values. But usually Jews, like non-Jews, like to eat, like to make families, like to spend time with friends and pursue their interests. And everybody is reaching for power. Everybody wants more and more power, more and more resources, more and more things that give them pleasure, right? We all angle towards a feeling of importance, like plants angle towards the sun. So there was no secret, slow, steady march through the institutions plan among Jews. When Jews were allowed to go to university, they poured into university. When they were allowed to take civil service jobs, they poured into the civil service. When they were allowed to become leaders in the military, they became leaders in the military, and they rose to the level of their talents. We don't associate Jewish doctors, Jewish lawyers, Jewish accountants with incompetence. Like, whatever you say about Jews, you don't genuinely expect that they'll be less competent on average than their non-Jewish peers. So there was no master plan for some slow march through institutions.
Both for, responding to opportunities that present themselves in the world, and being active in the world in the ways that we can be, culturally, politically, and so forth. But also to be thinking of this in terms of generations, right? So it is kind of a slow march. Like, we should be looking at a slow march, not necessarily through existing institutions, because existing institutions may not last that much longer in a lot of cases, right? But just a slow march in general. But a slow march does not preclude being active and dynamic simultaneously. Like, two things. Well, the right hand is doing one thing, the left hand can be doing another thing, I think. Our movement consists of many people, in a way that we're not online DR type, who's not even necessarily affiliated with any TRS. I think there are looking to perform different functions. And because I think that there are some healthy instincts, even though I would disagree with some of the ways in which they go about things. But guys like TRS, I think there are definitely healthy instincts there. Now, some of the people might be not the best or whatever, and I may have my criticisms, but I'm talking more about the kind of general, like, sort of online DR type who's not even necessarily affiliated with any group. It's a mixed bag, to say the least.
My strategy would be to force people to sort themselves into groups, make them pick a side and identify themselves, and then the ones who do want to go out there with their identity get to be in charge. But the alt-rights and rights are forced to pick a side.
Yeah, we're trying to do that to a certain extent.
Life forces you into groups, all right? Group strategies generally work much better than individualist strategies, right? A good, happy, effective life normally means living within community as opposed to just being a loner.
Richard and I are trying to do that. We're trying to get people to, pick a side.
I think the Christianity question, that really drives a wedge.
In a good one.
Yeah, and a necessary one. Yeah.
Yeah. It's because, look, and it's kind of, it's a little bit separate from the politics, though. I think that we understand religion is essentially, ultimately, kind of also a political formation as well as spiritual. And I think that that's also the way the Jews view it, that it is ultimately, religious or religio-political. But I think that it is an important question.
Jews are about the most secular people in America, right? You go to a hospice, I think they make this point later in the show, you'll find a smaller percentage of Jews talking about the afterlife and the comforts of heaven and the comforts of being with God compared to non-Jews.
I think that's entirely conceivable. Political Christian groups or something that could serve some useful purpose for us, and are not necessarily our adversaries politically. But I think that intellectually we have to kind of make enemies in this regard and just demarcate a zone, kind of psychologically healthy zone for us. You know what I mean? And draw people into that zone, because I think that, and again, I think I talk about the idea of even being crypto Apollonian. So theoretically.
Yeah, see, Mark Brahman and Richard Spencer think that the path forward for their movement is to be anti-Christian, to come out, very clearly against Christianity. So even though most of their supporters and potential supporters are Christian, they think that the path forward is to be anti-Christian. Make people, get woke on the Christian question.
Figure, but inescapably based in part on earlier dying and rising gods. On the simple premise alone that the miracles depicted in the New Testament are fictitious, REM theorists argue Christianity must be understood as false according to its own criteria. The second and perhaps far more important question is whether Christianity...
Did you know REM theorists hold this? REM theorists, there's just this whole body of REM theorists. There's like Mark Brahman and there's Richard Spencer, and that's about it. But REM theorists, man, they're on the cutting edge of societal evolution.
Regardless of the historicity of its miracles, is of value to Western civilization. To be clear, this is a question separate from whether or not religion in general is of value. Indeed, REM theorists do believe religion and theism of a particular type are necessary to cohere a civilization to a common purpose and to point it in a common eugenic direction.
REM theorists.
Proponents.
REM theorists. REM theorists.
You could, in this dawning period, you could have someone who is nominally a Christian but is really an Apollonian, because my idea of an Apollonian is someone who is of a kind of leadership caste, as it were, right? So you could have a politician who is basically like agrees with Apolloism, but is running for office in Europe or in America, and it doesn't, maybe especially in America, but maybe it makes sense for him to nominally be Christian in this instance or the other, and certainly not to offend Christians or say anything anti-Christian or anything like that. That person still could be an Apollonian who is basically advancing our goals. But
so this is Mark Brahman, Richard Spencer's buddy in Apolloism.
I think Richard and I are kind of condemned to basically be offensive to people, because we're not trying to get like a big political herd of people to follow us. I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to reach that elite that may be interacting with that sort of big Christian herd in a way that we're not. You know what I mean? But so that they're kind of made sort of sound or healthy in their worldview and can kind of go about politics in a way that makes sense for the future. It's not kind of clouded, by these bad ideas. Effectively, you know what I mean?
You can create.
Yeah, Apolloism. This is the way to push things forward
completely
and attract an elite
in our direction, effectively, right?
Yeah.
So I was just thinking, I'm not against the idea of people going into academics and starting to develop or promote Apolloism, for example, even if in a kind of
it's not against people going into the academy and promoting Apolloism
way at first. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm totally for that. And in fact, it seems like we've already made some friends in academia through the Christ mythicist stuff, and I think
just a huge following in academia, guys.
That will be a fruitful area for us in the future.
Great.
I'm not. I think so. Yeah, my broader point was that we have to be thinking long term. So, but I think that the DR is always like, well, let's get a politician in there and just kick out the Jews and just hit the rewind back to the 1950s or whatever. Whatever the sort of stupid idea is.
Right, the 1950s, where there were no Jews in America. I mean, come on, man. Come on.
The right is thinking. Again, I mean, look, there could be political developments that are very useful and positive for us, but we also have to be thinking long term. And there's another reason for this. The other reason is that let's assume that there's a very favorable political development and basically our guys get into power. Well, how are our guys going to sort of develop the society or think about the society? Are they going to start to say, okay, well, let's make it a Christian society again, right? So
their template, in all likelihood, their templates would be the 1950s.
So the alt-right is interesting in that virtually all its leaders are atheists, and almost all its followers are Christian.
There you go.
Yeah.
So I think you understand my point that we have to be developing
again.
We have to be developing intellectually and culturally just continuously, right? Because whoever, whether it's a gradual or it's a sudden process that puts a party in power or a faction in power that's on our side, they need something to look at. They need a kind of intellectual history. They need a cultural history. They need ideas to implement, right? I mean, literally, they could start building temples, but how are they going to even know what this shit means? I mean, Rome was had declined to the point that when Augustus reinstituted the cult of Apollo, they were trying to figure out what these symbols were meaning then. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Wow.
Because so much had been lost culturally, and so through decadence or decline, that so it's a similar problem in the sense that we have to have something that they can look at as a guide, so that when they are in power, they don't just kind of revert to a position that allows them to lose power in a generation or two, right?
It's really just three things: idealism, politics, religion. That's all you got to figure out. Yeah, that's it, really.
But they need something, and and I think that
idealism, politics, and religion. That's all that you guys need to figure out. Like, idealism can be useful, just as likely to lead you off in a deranged direction. You'll never figure out politics. Politics is how people organize themselves, in particular against some threat that wants to annihilate them, right? And religion is being the primary source of comfort for people in around the world for millennia. We are living in the world's first secular societies, right? Western Europe in particular is the world's first overwhelmingly secular society. And amusingly, in many ways, the United States is even more secular than Western Europe in that we're more atomized. We have a more efficient economic system. We have probably less mystery and magic to our daily lives. We have fewer ties to particular people and particular territory. Most people in Europe live within 8 miles of where their grandparents lived, where their grandparents were born. All right, there are national religions in Europe, so we're living through something unprecedented. The world's first secular societies, and they're not falling apart, but they definitely have problems. But people are in desperate need of comfort. And the things that religion used to provide, people are trying to find in movies, in yoga, in music, in clubs.
I think that Germany was, to use the, in many ways, unfortunate example of Nazi Germany. I think that they were kind of moving towards, they were sort of thinking of de-Christianizing, and they were moving toward a pagan idea of society. But some of their ideas were wrong, effectively, in my view. And Rosenberg was one of the...
the Nazis, they were really moving in the right direction by moving against Christianity, and we can learn from them.
Kind of chief cultural architects. And, really, in a lot of cases, for no fault of his own, he just got a couple of important things wrong. One of the ideas was that, Jesus was really an Aryan, for example. Now, I assume that, that's an interesting question. That's false. Obviously, it's inaccurate. And it's also, but in some cases, people are thinking of ways of easing people off Christianity. So if there's a kind of transition, there's a sort of transitional religion or something, or transitional religious idea that you can go into to kind of wean people off Christianity.
Hitler was two-faced. He presented himself to Protestants as a Christian. He pandered to them as a Christian. And a true visionary just wouldn't have to do that.
Well, politics is one thing, I don't, but it's, but politics, if you use the example of Trump and
so I was also appealing to Protestants also. He was doing the same thing, and the upper middle class supported him just like they did Hitler. So it was very similar. The liberals were right, actually. It was a similar dynamic.
Yeah. I was just going to ask, was Hitler was he anti-Christian ideologically, but appealing to it?
I think it's an opaque, it's not entirely clear exactly what Hitler's views were, but the general impression or sense that you can get, and people differ on this question, is that that he was, the guy gave an unabridged, the unabridged works of Nietzsche to Mussolini, right? That's recorded in Hitler's War by Irving. So, it seems very likely the guy was, he had basically assimilated Nietzsche's ideas on religion. And there are other signs that kind of point to that. But regardless, so it seems like the general sentiment, and there were Christians among the National Socialists, so it was a mixed bag to a certain extent. And toward the end of the war, some of the National Socialists would be viewing Christians as kind of deliberately undermining the effort in some cases, right? But I think that the general trend or tendency, or the plan, was to de-Christianize, but through a kind of these sort of palatable steps, which might include presenting Jesus as not really a Jew but an Aryan, as was Rosenberg's thesis. I honestly find it hard to believe that he necessarily believed that, but he was but maybe he did believe it. And then and then he was also very much in favor of the Norse myth and understanding Norse myth as a kind of like essential and primary myth of the German people. And you guys all know my views on Norse myth, but it's
actually, if I may jump in, Mark, 2 days ago was Friday the 13th, and I did some research on that.
Okay.
Apparently, Friday the 13th is based on a dinner in Valhalla where there were 12 gods dining, and then Loki came in. He was the 13th, and he killed Balder, and they were all crying and sad. And it sounds like the Jesus the Last Supper story, actually.
Yeah. There's a lot of examples like that. I mean, there's I've included more in my book, but there's a Garden of Eden, right, which is.
Where do you think Christianity came from? Where do you think Judaism came from? Where do you think Islam came from? Where do you think the Mormon Church came from? You think it just sprung out of the ground, just fully formed without any antecedents? No. All religions built upon that which was current at the time or had gone before them. So what became Judaism took some pagan rituals, some pagan practices, some pagan insights, and Judaize them, like turn them into monotheistic perspectives and monotheistic practices and monotheistic stories. And Christianity came along and took many pagan practices and gave them a somewhat monotheistic spin and Christianized them. So all religions built on what comes before them. It doesn't inherently discredit them.
Clearly a reference to the Garden of Eden, and it has the golden apples. And this is one of the things it brings upon Ragnarok, is that the giants steal the apples so that the gods start aging. They start dying because they no longer have this tree of life that they've been eating apples from. But in any case, but so that's that's a mistake that he makes. But it's also
they made some mistakes, but they got it right in being anti-Christian.
But part of that mistake, though, is that and one of the ideas he's an intelligent guy, and he's like a kind of like passionate writer. I think he did identify Apollo as an Aryan figure, which was good, but and he does seem to kind of suggest that Jews generally, but he doesn't kind of like clarify, I guess, in the way the concept of proto-Jews does. I think that sort of lends a lot of clarity to what's going on in the ancient world. But he does seem to be demarcating Dionysus as a sort of chthonic, ultimately kind of negative element, and Apollo is an Aryan element, which is distinct from Nietzsche, of course. But the Norse myth thing is an error. But the interesting thing about the error, though, is that he develops this idea that all of German art basically has to be kind of a reference or referential or be somehow bound to this Norse tradition. It can only be a kind of like a reiteration, or maybe a kind of veiled reiteration.
Right. You try to say that all of your art can only come from a certain subset of myths. Right? You got to strangle your art. Right? Let the art be free, bro. Let the art bang.
This sort of Norse legend, and but you see the problem, because it's not just like it's a problem on a couple of different levels. Because let's assume. I mean, it would be better if he was talking. Obviously, if we were talking about the Greco-Roman myth tradition, it would be better. But
we need more Greco-Roman man-boy love.
I think it's because what he's describing ultimately is what I would call God masking, right? In the sense that, like, let's say the Germans won the war, and there was an art movement, and they took this sort of Rosenbergian ideas, and they were like,
how much time do you think he spends fantasizing about? Oh man, what if the Germans won the war? Wouldn't that have been cool if only the Germans won the war? So sad that the Germans didn't win World War II.
That's not for everyone. And so again, it's a kind of self-selecting class. The Apollonian class is a self-selecting class, and it's a vetted class in the sense that, we will get people in here coming up with like really wacky shit, and we may have to kick out some of them if they.
Half Galatian says, "Luke, can I offload the burden of consciousness onto you? I've already finished with Kenneth Brown."
Persist in their insanity. I mean, because we're trying to keep ourselves.
Come on, guys! Have you even read Loki?
We're, in some ways, we're Orpheus having emerged from the underworld. We're trying to protect ourselves from the Maenads, the mad women that will tear us apart. You know what I mean?
I had a friend who said he knew somebody who worked at a hospice, and they said that by far Jews are like have the least faith, the least spirituality.
Oh yeah. Well, they have the highest. Well, and I honestly think that should be something that we allow. We should allow there to be atheist Apollonians, right? I mean, there are atheist Jews, so we should allow there to be atheist Apollonians. I'm not an atheist myself. I believe in God, but what exactly does that mean? What is my definition of God? Well, I believe that we're here for a purpose, and I believe that there is a kind of divine mind in the universe that maybe in some ways is kind of directing our actions. and wants us to do good and leave the world better than we encountered it. You know what I mean? I think that's so.
Mark, you almost sound like a monotheist.
Yeah. He does sound like a monotheist there. What's really going on, Mark?
Apolloism. And obviously Richard's on the call. I invite him to clarify here. But Richard said that Apolloism ultimately shouldn't be something that is, in a sense, obsessed with race, and this kind of relates to the broader DR, that the DR is kind of, in a way, milks the subject of race dry. And in a way, we need to kind of look beyond it. Obviously, Richard can clarify that if you would like. But yeah, in what sense do we not want Apolloism to be obsessed with race? Just kind of throw it out there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can talk about this first. Yeah, I think what I would say is just mere race. I don't want, and Mark doesn't want this either. I know that this is true. We don't want to create a religion or a theology in a proper sense of the term, like a logic.
Yeah, just a mere race or mere anything. It just wouldn't be sufficiently complex for such complex thinkers such as ourselves. We would never want to be reduced to anything, such as objective meaning
of understanding religion and thinking about spiritual matters. We don't want to create something that's just like a mask on white nationalism. And we don't want to just say that, like, well, we're really worshiping the white race, or this is about, immigration restriction, but we're just kind of dressing it up with a bunch of gods or something. I think that would be, first off, just transparent to our detractors, but I think it would also just be rather hokey and kind of not at all compelling to anyone. You have to just be a white nationalist and you want to kind of turn that into a religion. I see that as just a total non-starter. And so, I mean, and here's something that I guess is a little more controversial. And Mark and I were actually speaking about this 2 weekends ago, and it's something that has to go on to be nuanced. But I mean, we do understand Apollo as an emblem of our destiny, or as a guardian of our larger people group, and so on. We get that, but we need to communicate to people of all races.
And a question in the chat, Luke. Do you believe that erotic love between an adult female and an adolescent male as young as, say, 13 is categorically, without exception, in all cases, inherently and irredeemably unwholesome? I believe that in, say, America today, it is unwholesome such a high percentage of the time that, I'm fine with just saying, yeah, this is a bad idea. Right? I'm not sure the young man is going to be traumatized for life, but I would just say that it's so overwhelmingly a bad idea that it verges on 100%.
And so, again, cosmotheism, for instance, which was developed by William Pierce, did have, and others, it did have a philosophy to it. And maybe actually a lot of aspects of that philosophy might be, tantalizing for us. But it just did strike anyone who looked at it as just kind of like a mask on neo-Nazism. And I really don't want us to do that. I think there can, will, and should be a non-white person who resonates with Apolloism and maybe is an Apolloist to some degree.
That's big.
And I think that's actually very important, that what we're saying is a theology. It is a logic of theos. It is a way of looking at the world, and it isn't just a kind of exclusivist thing. I mean, I think I mentioned like the case of Norse paganism as well. I mean, that has a lot of problems, and I think Mark has, to an amazing extent, kind of unmasked Norse paganism as a deeply derived from Christianity. But beyond that, at least with the many existing Norse pagan groups, there are some egalitarian Norse pagan groups out there, but among many of them that we know, and that we might even know someone who's a member of, it does seem to be like, this is our religion. This is a religion for the white man, or maybe even a religion for the Northern European. And there can be some good things about that, but that is not what we're trying to do. We're not just trying to create a religion masquerade, or basically white nationalism masquerading as a religion.
Why are there so many blacks in the media? Because they're incredibly compelling personalities. I mean, they do command attention. They frequently have particular gifts with spontaneity. They tend to be less repressed, less boring compared to whites and Asians. So there's a visceral appeal. There's a force of personality there. It's not surprising to me that there are a disproportionate number of blacks in entertainment and, say, stand-up comedy.
It has to be compelling to all sorts of different people. And we're not doing this in order to have, the bad thing about Christianity is that it speaks to everyone. So our religion only speaks to, well-bred white men or something. That's not what we're doing here.
Oh, That's pretty exciting, guys. Apolloism open to people of any race. So I do think playing violent video games has a destabilizing effect on some people. I do think that playing violent video games probably makes many kids more aggressive, and I think it probably has that same effect on Japanese kids as it does on American kids, and there's a study here that I'm looking at. So there's an argument that all our research on violent video games must be wrong because Japanese kids play a lot of violent video games and Japan has a low violence rate. But by gathering data from Japan, we can ask, is it the case that Japanese kids are totally unaffected by playing violent video games? And of course they aren't. They're affected the same way that American kids are. Well, it is a good argument, right? Noting that Japanese kids play a lot of violent video games and then don't go out and commit much violence is an important point. That the Japanese have access to all sorts of pornography and don't go out and commit a lot of rapes and crimes and murders does indicate that pornography or violent video games are not a major source of, heinous crimes. But for some people on the margin, right, can they be negatively affected by what they see and do online? Of course. So video games don't create school shooters, but they create opportunities to be vigilant for enemies, to practice aggressive ways of responding to conflict, and to see aggression as acceptable. So when bumped in the hallway, children begin to see it as hostile, react more aggressively in response to it. Right, that's some academic experts here on violent video games. Looking at the comments section on Steve Saylor's site about the Buffalo shooting. So the shooter came from a rural township on the Pennsylvania border, home to a disturbing number of trailer parks and distribution centers, one of which is Amazon's. Why would anyone expect him to be sane? He grew up in a microcosm of modern America. He grew up in J.D. Vance land. Next comment. The worst thing you can do right now is to pick a fight on behalf of your team. This shooter will make it easier to disarm his own people, like the mosque shooter in New Zealand. I tend to distrust people who claim to feel no hate. I think hate is a normal human emotion. It is a human thing to feel homicidal rage. What is abnormal is to have no impulse control or to plan on actually wiping out people. If you're going to get into arguments, you've got to have a good autopilot. It's no use getting into trouble with HR, right? I've had plenty of situations with protected minorities at work. I've never been accused of saying anything racist, even though I am pretty damn racist. You can verbally escalate, or you can de-escalate a situation without using slurs. There are ways to avoid crossing the line that gets you fired or jail. Spend some time getting to know your opponent. You'll figure out their soft spots.
The logic I've seen coming from American neo-Nazis and white supremacists is that they're supreme because they're white, but then they follow that logic into believing that all whites are equal. They're supreme as a group, but inside the group they're all equal, and they're all just a place, but they refuse to admit like the hierarchy on the inside.
Absolutely, yeah. I see that very strongly, and it's very contradictory.
Yeah, and the liberal argument of like pointing to some crazed white nationalist with tattoos and who's overweight and flailing around with a big swastika banner or something, and they're like, oh, so this is the master race. I think that criticism has a lot of truth to it. But so you can take this in directions. You can say that I'm cucking here or something, or you could take it in the direction that Brendan just mentioned, or you can take it in the direction of, this way of thinking. Really, it should be universal in the best sense of the word, in the sense that it can actually speak and even resonate with people all around the planet. It isn't just a mask for the DR or a mask for racism or anything like that. Although it obviously will have a lot to say about that issue, about race in general, and about us and so on. Of course it will, but I don't.
So chat says, body shirt perfectly matches the microphone, peak podcasting. I'm just dissolving into the background. Dark shirt, dark background. Let me just fade away. Right? I don't matter. I am achieving peak nothingness. I am simply a vessel for the light and for love. Right, back to Steve Saylor's comments section. Steve Saylor, another vessel for light and love. This shooter probably grew up dirt poor, being told that he had white privilege by groups like Ford Foundation and people like Mackenzie Bezos because he is white. The news immediately plays up the race angle, but they did no such thing with similar shooting in Boulder, where a Syrian Muslim immigrant murdered 10 people, all of them white. So the shooter released a 180-page manifesto, roughly similar to the New Zealand guy's manifesto. Summary: great replacement fertility stuff. Number 2, FAQ, frequently asked questions. It reads like a Reddit Ask Me Anything. 3, different racial levels of IQ, complete with a bell curve distribution graph. 4, Michael Levin-like relentless list of racial crime statistics. Dissertation on black privilege. Section on Jewish elites. Torah quotes. Point 7, buy crypto, sell fiat. Number 8, detailed outline with diagrams. Come on, hold it down, lady. I'm trying to run a show here.
Yes, this is Gail Young.
Please. Back to the summary of the manifesto. So he cased the place, and he knew the habits of the employees, the location of the guard, and all the exits. So the Washington Post covered this. So apparently he visited the site a couple of months before the shooting, and the security guard asked him, "What are you doing going in and out?" So did the security guard make a report? Did they check the surveillance video? So Buffalo shooting suspect wrote of plans 5 months ago. He wrote in increasing detail of his plans to murder dozens of black people in statements posted online. So review more than 600 pages of messages that this guy uploaded in April. He resolved to kill those he slurred as replaces. He decided in February to target Buffalo Tops grocery store based on its local African-American population. So in March, he performed a reconnaissance-style trip to monitor the store security and to map out its aisles. When a store guard confronted him about why he'd repeatedly entered that day, Peyton Gendron made excuses and fled in what he described as a close call. Yeah, but did the supermarket follow up on this? Did they check this guy out? That's what I wonder. Okay, back to Steve Saylor's comment section. So a large part of the manifesto is all about what guns, what ammo is using, what helmet, what vest. That's more than half of the document. It's kind of a how-to. It reads like a file he kept adding to while planning, and he just pasted it into his document. And the next section, the manifesto touches on politics, immigrant rapists, diversity is a scam, radicalization of white men, overt assassination calls for various prominent globalists, immigration, birth rates, white Europe, and signs off with, "As for me, my time has come. Goodbye. God bless you all, and I hope to see you in Valhalla." So the kid writes well, seems pretty smart. Maybe he just used a good spell checker. But the text is generally clear, concise, organized, something that Grammarly just couldn't accomplish. So other than the fact he ended up a mass murderer, I see no obvious signs he is particularly mentally ill. So in that sense, it's particularly scary. And let us remember Jeffrey Dahmer. I don't murder and consume boys of color because I hate them. I murder and consume boys of color because I love them. Which Democrat megadonor Ed Buck might add, people just don't realize how easy it is to kill the homeless black men you love, especially when it is your fetish to murder them. And off topic, did anyone notice that it was Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin who made the phone call to the Russian Minister of Defense to talk about a ceasefire? That means that both Biden and Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, who should have made the call, are particularly useless at their jobs. Okay, so one important book that I've read in the past few years is by Dave Grossman. It's called On Combat, The Psychology and Physiology of Deadly Conflict in War and in Peace. So we've had violent video games for several decades now. Many kids who played them years ago are now in their 20s, 30s, 40s, right? The exact age group of the average perpetrator our law enforcement officers are confronting every day out on the streets. So when talking about conditioned reflexes, we must also talk about violent video games, understand how we can make killing a conditioned reflex. Stimulus response, stimulus response, stimulus response. It is important to understand how the average opponent is being trained. Does a kid playing a violent video game shoot at blank man-shaped silhouettes? How about bullseye targets? Right? So, yeah, I think violent video games play a role in all of this. Not the name factor, but they play a pretty significant role.
Ingram, this is the Ingram Angle live from New York City tonight. The real accomplices. That's the focus of tonight's angle. Now, when the CCP sees dissent building anywhere inside China, it moves really quickly to shut it down, scrubbing all of it from their social media, such as what happened over the weekend when more than 200 students protested all those harsh COVID measures that are in place at Peking University. They're brave kids. Because if the offender's views are deemed to be a danger to the communist state, a real danger, they'll be arrested, and if released, their passports confiscated. Well, that's what they did, remember, to that poor Cardinal Joseph Zen in Hong Kong. The reflex to silence opposition voices in a totalitarian state is one thing. But now it's also the impulse of Democrats here. With the November blowout looming and their party on the ropes, they're acting more like President Xi than President Kennedy or Bill Clinton. Their new motto seems to be, if you can't beat them, use your corporate shills to censor them. The justification is always some hurt.
So Laura Ingraham was about the first major media figure to hail Trump, to say that Donald Trump was showing the way, that he should become the Republican nominee, and he had a good chance of winning in 2016. So she was about the first major media figure to take him seriously. Question in the chat, what do I estimate is the average IQ of my listenership? I would say probably 115, which is, I think, the average IQ of a college graduate. And Apricot Sky is not just a movie, it's a movement. And this scene that I've been playing from Apricot Sky, it's as famous as From Here to Eternity, even when it's in 280 definition. But that's the best I got, mate. That's the best I got. Okay, Dave Grossman on video games. So when you play video games, you're shooting at people, vivid, realistic depictions of people. The holy grail of the video game industry is realism. Every year they get more real. So I started watching The Lincoln Lawyer on Netflix, and the murderer in that show is someone who's become incredibly rich by making his video game characters even more realistic. So these incredibly lifelike characters bleed, twitch, sweat, beg, fall, and die all before the eyes of the impressionable young players. And today's video games offer a completely different type of play than my generation engaged in. When I was little and playing Cops and Robbers, I said, bang, bang, I got you. Jimmy said, no, you didn't. Right? So one of the lessons that you learn is Jimmy is real, right? And if I hurt him, I get into big trouble. So for thousands of years, kids have whacked each other with wooden swords or played bang, bang, I got you. This was just play. Now kids are immersed in a virtual reality environment where they repeatedly blow their virtual, hyper-realistic playmates' heads off in explosions of blood and gore. Does that get them into trouble? No, they get awarded points. This is pathological and dysfunctional. Right? When kittens and puppies play, they gnaw at each other's throats. But when one of them gets hurt, the play stops and mama walks over to see what's going on. Video game industry says the images on the screen are not real people. This is true, but people are getting trained. There is a hyper-reality effect. Kids increasingly begin to think of the hyper-real as more meaningful than the reality it relates to. So the American Medical Association, American Psychological Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, and the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry in July 2000 made a joint statement to both houses of Congress. They say, well over 1,000 studies point overwhelmingly to a causal connection between media violence and aggressive behavior in some children. The negative impact of interactive electronic media, meaning violent video games, may be significantly more severe than that wrought by TV, movies, or music. So I think that movies and music and TV also probably exacerbate our crime rates. So when South Africa finally accepted television, they had a very significant jump in their murder rate. So other research indicates children who are least aggressive in nature, but once exposed to violent video games, become more likely to get into fights than children who are naturally very aggressive but do not play violent video games. Children who play violent video games see the world as a more hostile place. They argue with their teachers more frequently. They're more likely to be involved in physical fights, and they don't perform well in school. So for the first time in human history, we're dealing with a large-scale epidemic of preteen and teenage mass murderers. And the autopilot impact of these mass murder simulators has been obvious from the earliest of the school massacres.
Horrific shooting or a protest that goes wrong. And if the facts line up just right for them, they tag Republicans for it. And they did that, of course, with this weekend's horrific attack in Buffalo by a deranged racist.
Social media platforms that need to be monitored and shut down the second these words are espoused out there in these platforms. It has to stop.
Obviously, you have to balance the free speech issues, but freedom is so important to us, but that freedom also carries a public safety with it, and we have to balance those.
Oh, thanks, Nancy, because it's always portrayed, isn't it, as a noble endeavor, when the left, of course, wants to limit your speech. It's only a few key words.
Key words show up. They need to be identified. Someone needs to watch this and to shut it down the second it appears. And short of that, we will protect the right to free speech, but there is a limit.
Perhaps she thinks, I don't know, we're as stupid as her party in Albany is corrupt, but we're not. The Angle, as always, condemns all violence and believes in the most stringent prosecution of all violent crimes. Like the overwhelming majority of law-abiding Americans.
Okay, guys, turn around.
I look up and I'm the only one around.
Bye-bye.
Pick up the pieces of my broken heart. Love shattered mirror of a new start.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
I see the picture falling. The patterns change again.
Bye-bye.
It seems that nothing ever lasts. I hear the distant falling inside myself again. I know that you understand.
Bye-bye.
I'm starting back where I first began. You might not know the man I am. I feel the world exploding inside my mind again.
Bye-bye.
I know that this time is real.
Turn around.